Hello, everybody, and greetings to everybody on VC. I'm Karen Wickery, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest, Clay Shirky, today. Clay, his day job is teaching at NYU in the Interactive Telecommunications program, but the guy manages to sneak in a lot of writing and speaking somehow to his schedule. I still have Here Comes Everybody half read, and now Here Comes Cognitive Surplus. So he's busy all the time. He's a really insightful speaker and thinker on the internet and the collision of online and offline worlds, and I know you're going to enjoy his talk. So please give a welcome to Clay.
Thank you. Am I on? Yes. Thank you very much, and hello everybody in VC land. Yes, as you heard, and we can go to the slides. Got a book came out last Thursday, Cognitive Surplus. It's in fact available for sale in the back. Exit through the gift shop. And rather than talk about cognitive surplus in the abstract, I want to start with a story that I think illustrates what's happening now with this collective resource. So the story starts in January of last year, January of 2009, in Mangalore, India, where a Hindu fundamentalist group, Sri Ram Sini, attacks women in pubs. They drag the women out of the bars, slapping them, hitting them. When men step in to try and defend, the men are also attacked. And as is by now usual, all of this is documented with photos and videos and camera phones uploaded to Flickr and YouTube. I guess I have to say Picasa and YouTube here, but uploaded to photo and video sharing sites. And after these images become widespread, Sri Ram Sini says, we attacked those women because they were not living up to our ideals of Hindu womanhood. They were not being sufficiently chaste, they were not being sufficiently private, and our next attack is going to be on Valentine's Day. If you're a woman in Mangalore and we catch you out of doors with a male who is not your blood relative, we will attack you again. Right? So this puts the women of Mangalore into a classic collective action problem. Each woman faced with the question of what to do on Valentine's Day can say quite reasonably, I'm staying home. But of course, by doing that, collectively they will be capitulating to Sina's demands. Or each woman could say, perhaps there will be strength in numbers. If enough of us turn out, maybe we can see off this threat. But they have to make that calculation without knowing what the other women facing the same decision are also deciding. Right? So against this threat by Pramod Mutalik, who's the leader of Sri Ram Sini, steps up a woman who proposes a third option to this collective action dilemma, Nisha Susan, who is a Mangalore resident. And Susan proposes a way to solve the collective action problem collectively, rather than having the solution have to be worked out by each of the individuals. And so she founds my favorite Facebook group, the collection of loose, or the Association of Loose, Forward, and Pub-Going Women. Right? And it's a very popular group, as you might imagine. Thousands of people pour in, become members of this group. And their first announced action is the Pink Chaddi campaign. Now, the members of Sri Ram Sini are derided as underpants wearers because they favor these khaki shorts, which people say look like diapers. So the women of the Association of Loose Forward and Pub-Going Women decide that they're going to mail pink underwear to Pramod Mutalik and to the members of Sri Ram Sini. And so they get a lot of pink underwear, they write messages across the back, they mail it in. And this has three immediate effects. One of the effects, of course, is to enrage Sri Ram Sini, who says, this is terrible, we're going to mail these women appropriately covering garb in return. They didn't actually do that, they just said that they were going to do that. The second effect was on the Indian government, who saw an organized group of citizens who cared about a particular issue and vote. And so they decided to arrest Mutalik for the attacks, Mutalik and some of the senior leaders of Sri Ram Sini, on February 13th, thus clearing Valentine's Day from the attacks. And the third group, right, the third group benefiting from this was the women of Mangalore themselves, who saw that here was a way that they could pool their otherwise uncoordinated actions to achieve an outcome that wouldn't have been possible without this coordinating effect. Right? So this ability to pool those kind of resources together is what I'm calling cognitive surplus, right? Cognitive surplus has two pieces, right? One of them is the free time and talents available in the educated world, right? Cumulatively, as a population, we have over 1 trillion hours a year to give over to activities we like or care about. And it is that free time and talent that are used in places like the Association of Loose Forward and Pub-Going Women. But we had that free time in the 20th century, too. In fact, that free time built up dramatically after the Second World War, with rising educational attainment, rising life expectancy, and rising population. In the 20th century, we didn't get events like this. That's the second piece of cognitive surplus. It's not just that we have free time and talents, but now we have a medium that can allow us to find each other and to pool our efforts, not to treat free time as something to be used up on an individual level, but rather to treat it as something that can be used in aggregate at the group level. Right. Here is another example of that. Oops, I'm sorry. So to express, right, what is possible now with cognitive surplus, I needed a metric, and there wasn't an obvious one. So I called up my friend Martin Wattenberg at IBM's research lab, who studies Wikipedia. And together we hashed out what we thought might be a measurement of what's possible. So Wikipedia is our oldest and largest example of general public participation in a shared project. And Wikipedia, Martin and I worked out in a kind of back of the envelope way, has taken something like 100 million hours of cumulative human thought. Every page in every language, every edit, every talk page, something on the order of 100 million hours, right? So take the #1 use of free time in the developed world, which is, of course, watching television, right? If you imagine graphing the total number of hours, right? Imagine a graph of the total number of hours of television. In the US, we watch 200 billion hours, right, every year, right? Wikipedia would be here, right? So there is such an enormous amount of free time that even very slight increases in our ability to pool it together and even very slight upticks in our desire to participate can lead to dramatically different effects than we were used to from the media landscape in the 20th century. So here's an example of that, another story of that at work. This story from Kenya in the beginning of 2008. Right? Kenya had a presidential election, hotly disputed, and in the aftermath of the election, electoral violence broke out, or rather ethnic violence broke out post the election. And Oriokola, a lawyer living in Nairobi, was blogging about this at her blog, Kenyan Pundit, which became one of the sites of the discussion of the events in Kenya. And as she was blogging about this in the aftermath of the election, the Kenyan government announced a complete media blackout on all live reporting of any sort. And so suddenly, the Kenyan blogosphere went from being part of the media landscape to being one of the principal sources of information about what was going on, given the lockdown of the traditional press. So Okola began soliciting narratives from her commenters who would come offer things to her. Okola would post them on the site, aggregate things. And Kenyan Pundit, her blog, became so indispensable that she said, I can't keep up. Right? I could do this 24 hours a day, and I couldn't publish all of the information that's coming in from my own commenters. If only there was a way to do this automatically. 2 programmers showed up in the comments, held their hands up, and said, we could build that. Right? 72 hours later, Ushahidi launches. Ushahidi, I was actually chastised this morning for mispronouncing it. It's Ushahidi, is a very simple tool for crisis mapping. All it does is it takes reports from the field, whether over the web or email or critically SMS off the mobile phone. It aggregates them and it puts it on a map. And what it does is it takes what the population knows as a whole in a tacit and distributed way and aggregates it and makes it public and observable. And in doing that, right, they take a diffuse general knowledge that isn't of much use and they turn it into an actual resource. This worked well enough in Kenya that the programmers who had been working on it decided to turn it into a platform, and it's now become a general purpose crisis mapping tool. All volunteer labor, open source project. It's been used in Mexico to track the risk of electoral fraud. It's been used in Washington, D.C. to track snow removal, right? First world problems. It's been used most famously in Haiti in the aftermath of the awful Port-au-Prince earthquake to track both emergencies and also places where there's security threats, public health outbreaks, infrastructure, medicine, all of it. Right? It has gone, in less than 3 years, it has gone from its East African origins to become a worldwide tool. And when you go on the site and you look at the map, right, and you see the places where Ushahidi has been implemented, it's everywhere but Antarctica. What Oriocola did would not have been possible without digital technology. What Oriocola did would not have been possible without human generosity. And what's interesting to me now is the stories where both of those things are true. The stories that become possible because both of those things are true. Not just shiny new technology making new kinds of things possible. That's a story that's well told. But rather technology providing an opportunity for ancient human motivations of generosity and participation to manifest themselves on a public stage in a way that's much larger, covers a larger geographic area, and is much longer lived than we were used to generous acts being before. Right? So taking this combination of human generosity and digital opportunity, we are seeing in examples like the Nisha Susan story, like the Oriocola story, incredible use of the cognitive surplus. And when you look around, right, you can see this everywhere. Cognitive surplus is leading to amazing efforts in scientific, literary, artistic, political creativity of the sort that we would not have expected to see. Right? It also leads, of course, to lots and lots of lolcats. Right? Lolcats, cute pictures of cats made cuter with the addition of cute captions, are also a use of the cognitive surplus. Right? Because free time is free time, experiments are experiments. There's no need for it to be high-minded. It can be all over the map, and in fact, it is. Now, it's tempting to want Ushahidi without the lolcats, to get the good stuff without the throwaway culture. But that's not the way media revolutions work. Freedom to experiment means freedom to experiment, full stop, right? This isn't the only revolution where that has happened. When we got the sacred printing press, we got erotic novels 150 years before we got scientific journals, right? So, first example of each separated, as you can see, by some span of time. So this is actually the normal case for large changes in the abundance of media and for greatly lowered cost of participation and creation. The key thing here is not whether you get a mix of low and high culture, of throwaway and stuff that lasts for the ages. The key thing here is, on this side of the equation, right, how much of what matters isn't about the technology itself, but about the culture that forms around it. And that, I think, and this is one of the central theses of the book, that's the moment we're in right now. Not fighting over the technology, the basics of which we have largely sketched in. And it's not fighting over the possibility of participating, which is manifesting itself visibly and daily in all kinds of ways. It's really the cultural assumptions around those possibilities that are, I think, the big open question now. So to make an analogy, again, continuing on the comparison with the printing press, here is an image of an alchemist's laboratory. And here is an image of a chemist's laboratory. Spot the difference? No, of course not. There is no difference, right? The interesting thing about the transition from alchemy to chemistry is that alchemists and chemists had the same tools. They had braziers and vials and scales, right? Alchemists and chemists had the same techniques. There was no technical revolution that kicked off chemistry, right? Alchemists and chemists were, in many cases, the same people who simply converted from one way of doing things to another way of doing things. the difference between alchemy and chemistry, the thing that kicked off chemistry as a science, was not about the tools, it was not about the techniques, it was about the culture. In the 1640s, a group of people who got together, calling themselves natural philosophers, as scientists, essentially the precursor to scientists, got together in the United Kingdom and called themselves the Invisible College. And the Invisible College was invisible because they had no physical home, neither in Oxford or in Cambridge. They met in coffee houses and they communicated through letters. And they set themselves on a remarkable task, which is that they decided, formally and as a group, that they would not believe anything that was not true. Right? Now this is hard, because we are not, as a species, well equipped to subject our own beliefs to the kind of withering scrutiny that would tell us when our beliefs are wrong. We do, however, have a related skill. We're very good at subjecting other people's beliefs to withering scrutiny, right? Enter the scientific journal, right? The thing that moved us from alchemy to chemistry was the decision to publish, to make public. And in fact, the members of the Invisible College wrote quite bitterly about the writings of the alchemist because it was incredibly obscure. And even if an experiment was described, there was no guarantee that you could recreate it. And even if you could recreate it, there was no guarantee that you could understand the results. And so the chemist's motto, nothing from words, meant that they would not believe any assertion without seeing it published in such a way that someone else could try it to test the results. Right? That kind of cultural shift is, I think, both the opportunity and the challenge we face now. Not what the tools make possible, right? But what culture we can build around the tools to make the tools useful. The printing press did not cause the scientific revolution. And also, the scientific revolution would not have been possible without the printing press. Both of those things are true, and the thing that balances those statements are the cultural decisions around the use of the tools, not the tools themselves. So I want to talk about an example where I see people trying to make this kind of cultural change part of their work. This is one of the most audacious attempts I know of presently to do this kind of thing. This is a screenshot from a site called Patients Like Me. And Patients Like Me aggregates patient data from long-term degenerative diseases with either few or no cures. They are, among other things, now the holders of the largest data set on Lou Gehrig's disease. And on Patients Like Me, individual patients set up a username and list information about themselves. This is a 23-year-old female from Scotland who has depression and anxiety, and she graphs her mood, right? Both in point moments, and she talks about her mood over time. Is she high functioning? Is she low functioning? Is she feeling a lot of distress? And this will be this is giving away no state secrets inside Google, the ability to aggregate data across a bunch of small, unreliable sources changes things, right? Quantitative data at large enough scale becomes qualitative data. So they're able to do things like say, what drug are you on? What dosage has your doctor got you on? And they can see the consensus view of the medical profession as a graph of the dosage of these various drugs. The pharma companies do not have this data. Only Patients Like Me is able to aggregate this at large enough scale. Right? Now, this is an attempt to create an alternate medical culture. Right? And it's, right, Patients Like Me is itself a commercial site, and yet they're plainly engaging the participants in cultural ways. Right? So it is a mix of for-profit and non-for-profit motivations. It's a mix of intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. And that seems really strange. In fact, there's a thesis that's been proposed by Nicholas Carr, an idea proposed by Nicholas Carr, that he calls the digital sharecropper thesis, right? Why are people contributing their data in a way that's making other people rich? Why are people uploading videos or photos adding to Google or Yahoo share price? Right? To which my response has always been that Flickr and YouTube are nothing compared to Lego, who's tricked 2 generations of the world's children into assembling their products for them, thus saving billions of dollars at the factory while violating international child labor laws, right? And once you see that once you see that model, it's obvious, well, the kids like putting the tools together, right? So in fact, there is this mix in commercial operations of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. The only real surprise is that it's now happening in the media landscape, where in an environment where previously only professionals had access to the public sphere, now we all do. Now, it's a curiosity of our historical era, and I don't think we'll ever know whether this was coincidence or some kind of deep convergence, that as experiments like this are going on, as people are using the cognitive surplus to bring users together to create resources, services, value that couldn't have existed otherwise, social sciences are also starting to tell us a lot about human motivation, and in particular, the ways in which our intrinsic motivations matter more than we'd been told in the 20th century. Right? The 20th century picture of humanity, that it was the kind of consensus view, was that humans are rational, self-maximizing, self-interested actors who will always try to get the better deal in any given transaction with another human being. But as Elinor Ostrom, who is the most recent Nobel laureate in economics, has shown in her work, the irony is that if you design systems to assume that the actors are selfish, you end up designing systems in which the most selfish actors do best, right? And what we're starting to learn instead is that we have intrinsic motivations, non-financial motivations, that affect our behavior in profound ways that aren't demonstrated, aren't explained by neoclassical economics or the sort of attendant social theory. Here is an example of one of those explanations from recent research. This is a graph from, excuse me, from an essay published by Yuri Nisi and Alfredo Rustaccini in the Journal of Legal Studies at the beginning of this decade. And Nisi and Rustaccini set out to examine what they call deterrence theory. Very simple theory, widely held, particularly in the legal profession, hence the journal they published it in. And deterrence theory is very simple. If you want someone to do less of something, add a punishment. If you want someone to do more of something, take a punishment away. Straightforward, commonsensical, also largely untested. So they said, we're going to test that. So they went and observed 10 daycare centers in Haifa, Israel. And they observed those daycare centers at the moment of highest tension, which is pickup time. Because at pickup time, the teachers have been with your children all day. And they would like those children returned to your care at the appointed hour and no other. Meanwhile, you know, maybe you're a little late at work or you're running an errand, there's traffic, you want a little slack to pick your kid up late. So Nisi and Rustaccini said, how many episodes, at these 10 daycare centers, how many episodes are there of late pickup time on average? The x-axis is weeks elapsed of observation, y-axis is number of late pickups, and you can see that there are between 6 and 12 late pickups a week across these 10 daycare centers. So they took these daycare centers, they put them in two groups. The group in the white squares is the control group. They did nothing. The group with the black diamonds is the experimental group. And to the half the daycare centers that were in the experimental group, they said, okay, we are changing the deal as of right now. You pick your kid up more than 10 minutes late, 10 shekels, added to your bill, no ifs, ands, or buts, automatic fine. And the minute they added the fine, the behavior at those daycare centers changed. Late pickups went up every week for the next 4 weeks, topping out at triple the pre-fine average and then fluctuating it between double and triple the pre-fine average for the remainder of the experiment. Right. You can see immediately what happened, right? The fine broke the culture. Right? When Nisi and Rustaccini communicated to the parents that by paying 10 shekels they had discharged the whole of their debt to the daycare center, and that there was no residue of social concern or guilt left, the parents quite reasonably said, 10 shekels to pick my kid up late. What could be bad? Right? So this goes on for a while. And then they say, okay, that was very interesting. Thank you very much. The fine is over. We're done with this phase of the experiment. And then a really interesting thing happened. Nothing changed. Right? Not only did the fine break the culture, but once it was broken, it stayed broken even though the fine was removed. So they have now contradicted both halves of the deterrence thesis. They've added a punishment and made the behavior worse. They removed a punishment and not made the behavior any better. Right? Now, the neoclassical explanation of these daycare centers says that in the absence of a contract and a fine and some kind of formal agreed behavior, the parents and the teachers were operating together with no constraints. But that's not true. They were just operating with cultural constraints. And as we can see from the control group here, humming along as they were, the cultural constraints actually created a more generous environment than the contractual ones. This doesn't mean we never need contracts. It does mean we need to be very careful about designing social systems that assume that contracts can either automatically augment or automatically substitute for cultural norms as a way of coordinating group behavior. So, back to patients like me. There's a 23-year-old woman in Scotland who's uploading her diagnosis, her symptoms, her medications, the amount of the dose. All of these things violate every message that comes in public about medical privacy. Oh my God, don't share that information. Don't tell people you're manic depressive. Don't tell people you suffer from anxiety. Don't tell people you're taking this drug. Don't tell them how much of it you take. What Patients Like Me has in mind isn't just a kind of alternative that will help the people who come together on the site. What they have in mind is nothing less than breaking current culture around sharing. So at the bottom of every page, they have a privacy policy, as one would if you were in their business. And they say, we will keep your data private to the degree that you want us to. But they also have something called an openness philosophy, and it is linked to, not by accident, next to the privacy policy wherever it appears. And on that page, they make a really dramatic argument to the users of the site saying, we're abiding by what the law requires of us to keep your data private, and we recognize that we're operating in a culture that assumes privacy as the norm, and a really tightly held to the chest privacy at that. And notwithstanding all of that, we think that all of our lives will be better if we share this data. We can accelerate medical research. We can find panels of sufferers of a disease faster. We can get more variable panels. We can lower the cost and increase the outcomes of cures for these diseases. If all Patients Like Me does is succeeds in making its own users feel better, they will actually have failed. Right? They've set out to do nothing less than change the prevailing culture of the business they are operating in. And that is an effort, I think, on the level of audacity that reminds me of what the Invisible College was up to. Which brings me back to the lolcats. So cognitive surplus is a general resource available to all of us if we can put an opportunity out there that attracts the ancient human motivations of people feeling autonomous or competent, feeling a sense of membership or generosity, the kinds of intrinsic things that make us want to donate our free time to these various activities. And there are an enormous range of activities that are now resulting from this new shared resource. Right? The story we had in the 20th century was that we all liked to be couch potatoes, that we sat around watching TV all the time, and that was our participation in the media landscape, because that was how we wanted to be. Right? Now we have a medium that doesn't just let people consume, it also lets us produce, and it lets us share, and we're seeing lots and lots of versions of that appear. Right? So lolcats is one example of that. Another example, I pulled this off mock pages, off a Lego fan site. This is the Lego zombie group. It's people who only build zombie-like models of Legos, but then of course share their construction in voluminous detail. And then of course Wikipedia, which I already touched on, and finally Patients Like Me, which I just talked about. A kind of sketch of the range of the use of cognitive surplus. But here's the thing. There's a different kind of value, right, being produced. There's a different model of value being created on each of these sites. Right? The value created by something like lolcats, essentially an aggregate of funny stuff, is basically personal. If you want to crack yourself up or crack your friends up on a coffee break, you can always go to icanhascheeseburger.com, and purveyors of lolcats worldwide, And you don't have to be a member of a community in any meaningful fashion to do that. Right? The value from lolcats is essentially an aggregate of personal motivation to upload the cats and then personal motivation to look. Right? The Lego groups don't work quite that way. They are more tightly bound to one another. Right? You do need to be a member of a community on some level to get the kind of community of practice value of I saw this person do this, and then I took that drawing or that sketch and I built on it. Right? So this is value created by the members of the community for each other. The value is created inside the community and largely captured inside the community as well. Wikipedia, a different kind of value yet again. This is value created by their participants, but enjoyed by the public at large. Right? 1/3 of a billion people check into Wikipedia every month, but only a tiny, tiny fraction of those people edit pages, about 2%, and only a tiny, tiny fraction of that are Wikipedians, people deeply committed to the project. So that small group has an enormous amount of leverage on creating what's become, in less than 10 years, the most important reference work in the English language. This is public value. And finally, patients like me, for the reasons I just discussed, civic value. Right? Patients like me doesn't mean to just make life better for its users or for the general public. It actually means to change the civic culture it operates in. So this is where the book ends, and this is where I will end. This seems to me to be the great open question now, is what we do with this resource on this axis. Right? Now, I like lolcats as much as the next guy. I actually maybe like them more even than the next guy. But I have a hard time envisioning a future where some internet user is saying to themselves, where, oh where can I find a picture of a cute cat? Right? That strikes me as being a largely solved problem. Right? Up here, I have no idea whether or not patients like me will succeed. That is an incredibly audacious goal they have set for themselves. And the forces arrayed against patients creating the kind of value for themselves that used to be captured by the market, even at the price of great inefficiency, is going to lead to increasing pushback if they start to succeed. Expect to see attempts to see them legislated out of business within a year or two. I have no inside knowledge about this. This is just a prediction about the kinds of forces we have seen at work in other industries. So the lesson here, I think, is given this cognitive surplus and given that we can take this end of the range as a basically solved problem, the action is up here. Right? Dean Kamen, the inventor and entrepreneur, said, free cultures get what they celebrate. Right? The opportunity we have here is for us to be the people who both do but also celebrate and aid the people taking on public and civic value. It's the harder value to create. The more of that kind of value there is, the more opposition there will be from society. But ultimately, our ability to see to it that the public and civic-minded uses of this succeed will be the thing that determines how much value we end up getting out of this cognitive surplus. Thank you very much. I think I've got, time for a couple of questions. There's a mic, down in the middle.
So it's a wonderful vision. I like the communal, the public, the personal, the civic, and all that. And you've been telling us really great, warm, fuzzy stories. There is the other side of the same coin, which are represented by things like 4chan. And those same technologies, those same mechanisms can be used to create great disruptions. And in the battle for the hearts and minds of the civic / internet / information enabled universe, how's this going to work out?
Well, so this is one of the great questions. Freedom is good, right? And it sounds dumb when you say it that way, but that's kind of my animating belief. And one of the things I've observed is that in our catalog of communicative freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, we have widespread freedom of speech, and freedom of press and freedom of assembly have been narrowly distributed. Now those are also becoming widely distributed. And it seems to me that the the question around the harm that can be done by groups. 4chan is on the list, but I think well down from, say, Al Qaeda or the pro-anorexia kids. I mean, there's lots of these examples, and plainly some of them in the book. What we do with free speech is we shift from interdicting it in advance to responding to it when it happens. Right? We're not yet used to that for public speech and public coordination by amateurs because we haven't had a world where that's been a big problem so far. But when I talk about free cultures getting what they celebrate, a lot of this is really about putting the attention on the people who are doing that work. I mean, 4chan especially, to take that example, is certainly out for nothing if not attention. And the shifting of that, by no means easy, really comes down to, I think, finding the groups that have the cultural norms that use these tools. Again, back to the Invisible College example, right? The groups that say we're going to use this to create positive value. At the end of any big transition like this, there are good new things and bad new things. And in some cases, our inability to stop groups from forming, something we enjoyed quite a lot in the 20th century and now don't enjoy almost at all, is just going to go in the bad column. And so our job becomes not stopping those bad things from happening completely, because we can't, but rather making sure that the good we get out of the good stuff is high enough to counterbalance it. In the same way that freedom of speech means Nazis get to march in Skokie, but it also gives us the environment that we're all fortunate enough to live in now. So I don't mean to sugarcoat this, but in a way, out of a kind of almost fatalist view that there is no future in the internet revolution that doesn't include new bad effects, our ability to recognize and highlight the good effects is the only thing that will change the balance in the favor of the value of the revolution over the long haul.
Right. Thanks.
Sure.
One of the things you just mentioned in your last answer was that members of 4chan do what they do for attention. Mm-hmm. But what I wanted to ask you is, in light of the fact that 4chan is, for all intents and purposes, anonymous, mm-hmm. where does anonymity fit into the amount of value generation by this cognitive surplus? And is it something that we should try to preserve, or is it something, obviously the paradigm is shifting towards non-anonymous activity?
Right.
And what is the, I guess,
so here's, I think all attempts to say we need to have a non-anonymous internet, full stop. Recently, again, this language has come out of Italy. Periodically, the world's governments decide this is a good idea for all the reasons you would expect. South Korea is going, as I don't have to tell you because they've been locked out of YouTube for a while. That every time one of the world's governments says that they're going to drain the swamp of anonymity, they're almost always operating out of a desire to prevent politically motivated actors from having publicly accessible speech without national control, which I think is something we should be skeptical about. Where I think this is going is what Bob Axelrod showed in his Prisoner's Dilemma work, the original sort of computer modeling of just very simple interaction patterns, which is that small groups of cooperating actors can actually build an environment for themselves inside a larger hostile environment in which value is possible. Where I think anonymity is going is away from a general class of availability on the internet to a site-by-site and an area-by-area decision as to whether or not to allow things to be anonymous. So some weblogs will say, in order to encourage civil discussion and kind of long-term conversational value among well-known participants, you have to log in and you at least have to have a well-defined pseudonym, right? If you look at what Jeff Atwood and Joel Spolsky are doing with Stack Overflow, really amazing in terms of value creation around persistent pseudonyms for making sure you get good action. And then you look at WikiLeaks, and you think the design of WikiLeaks has to have the opposite set of characteristics in order to do what they do. Now, again, this is without saying, without putting WikiLeaks in either the wholly good or wholly bad category. WikiLeaks is an example of a site that couldn't work with those characteristics. So I think the big fight right now is, funnily enough, not in the social norms around anonymity or not anonymity, which we've got relatively well worked out. It's in the technological ease of use around making the decision, I'm going to make this site privilege pseudonyms or real names, right? If I could go back in time and do anything different to the internet other than fixing the 32-bit address space problem, I would go back to the OAuth people and I would beg on bended knee, beg for that to be easier to implement. Because right now, even the people who want to flip the bit to say, we're creating a protected environment for a less anonymous, a site of less anonymous speech, can't make that choice easily. It's better than it was, but it's not great yet. Wikipedia, I'm on the advisory board of Wikipedia, although I don't speak for them. But one of the big conversations there, for the obvious reason, is around, well-known actors. And it's used as an implicit heuristic right now. But there is no identity commons good enough for Wikipedia to say, this is low enough cost that we can throw this in people's way, and it won't significantly impact the number of edits we get. And it's that, right? It's funny, having just given a whole talk in which I'm saying, the technology, it's largely done, now concentrate on the social problem. This is actually one of the places where it's really like the engineering hurdle for someone who wants to say, we'd like a conversation among well-known actors for all the good we get out of that. Like, that engineering hurdle is still too high. So, there it is. Great, thank you. Yes, sir.
I'm totally sure I'm going to screw up his name, but Jaron Lanier,
Yeah,
the You Are Not a Gadget guy.
Yeah.
So that just came out, and he's pretty anti any kind of anonymized
Yes, he
group
is.
organization, right? So how would you respond to that? I mean, obviously there's these kind of good examples one after another, but he says the ultimately the dehumanizing effect. Right?
Yeah. I mean, this is interesting. So Jaron's book is out. Nick Carr's book, also The Shallows, is out. And Jaron is the more complicated case in a way, which I guess goes without saying for anything having to do with Jaron. There is a lot in there that reads to me like pure iconoclasm, right? The kind of "you kids keep off my lawn" aspect of, the music today, these kids with their, it's awful. It's awful. I'll tell you, in Brooklyn, the music scene right now is exploding. So that strikes me as being interpretive in a way that doesn't ramify outside what's going on inside Jaron's head. On the other hand, his critique of anonymity to the earlier question is exactly right. Right? What he says is wrong there is wrong. And this is, I think, the great shift in my period, now coming in on 20 years of working on and thinking about these technologies. In the 90s, the conversation about the internet was conducted between people who knew something and people who knew nothing, right? There wasn't a lot of, we used to talk about whether people would get it or not. Now we've got people like Jaron, who knows as much about the network as I do, but are strongly pessimistic. Nick Carr I'd put in the same category. It seems to me now that the important distinction isn't between optimists and pessimists, but between hand-wringers and experimenters. And that's what gets me now. When I read The Shallows, I'm yep. The internet's distracting. Like, who would disagree with that thesis, right? Carr quotes Cory Doctorow, right? When Nick Carr and Cory Doctorow agree about something, it can fairly safely be said to have passed into the realm of received wisdom. And then you get to the part of the book where Carr tells us what to do, and that part is missing. There's nothing in there. He doesn't even say what his own practices are, right? The guy just wrote a book while being distracted by the internet, so he's got something going on, right? He doesn't even tell us how he manages that. And I have the same concern about Jaron's stuff, which is if you read You Are Not a Gadget, you don't leave knowing what to do, right? Which is to say that there's such a lumping together of he doesn't like Wikipedia and has some more respect for open source, but he can't quite sort out the distinction. And there's an opportunity in there to say Wikipedia would be better if it did X, right? And Wikipedia is all ears about that. No X, right? And so the the pessimists are generally right about what's wrong with the internet, but funnily enough, the people who have the best position to make those claims are not using that position to then say, here's an opportunity to do something. My hope, I guess, is that those of us on the experimenter side read the pessimists, read Jaron, read Nick, with an open mind and say, oh yeah, that anonymity thing, that has really been a problem in a number of areas. Or, yes, I can absolutely see how I get distracted by having all of these alerts on. But then taking that as input for, here's some experiments I'm going to do so that I can concentrate more, or so I can set up a low-cost environment in which anonymity is chased out of the system. And you know, of the current crop of pessimist book, that's, I think, the use I hope, you know, us and our tribe, to speak loosely, make of them. So, thank you.
So really interesting to hear about this idea of trying to make significant civic change. I think we have a situation, I'll exaggerate to make the point, where to be elected in politics, you need to lie, okay? And what do you think, I'm probably not alone here in wanting to see a system where actually people can tell the truth, have measured debate, and still get into politics. Do you have ideas about how that could be achieved along these kind of lines, and how long it would take?
Yeah, yes to the first, no to the second. So one of the great conundrums right now of the current administration, right? When it became clear that Obama was going to win, we all turned our attention to, is he going to govern like he campaigned, right? Is he going to use these tools to run the people's business the way he used the tools to get the people's vote? And we seemed to get an answer the day after the election when they launched change.gov, right? So you come in and tell us, right, we're going to put a brief on the president's desk that is the accumulation of the nation's wisdom about the really important problems. And the really important problem turned out to be medical marijuana, right? During two wars, not counting the war on terrorism, plus the worst financial meltdown in 70 years, right? Medical marijuana and out of the top 50, 16 other war on drugs efforts pushed their way into the top 10. And it seems to me that the mistake there was to have a single cue where there was a single namespace worth fighting over, right? Woe betide the person who implements a single namespace worth fighting over. And the medical marijuana people were only able to make their point, a quite reasonable point about the war on drugs, by drowning out everyone else. And they were able to do that because they were better organized and they had a clearer mission statement. So when you go back and you look at the design of the U.S. Constitution, James Madison, one of the architects of the Constitution, spent a lot of time saying you're gonna get factions, right? Do not try and pretend that there's such a thing as special interest groups, that you can get rid of. All groups are special interest groups. Government is the place where factions contend, not the place where we get rid of factions. So it seems to me that to get to a place where we can have the kind of environment you want, we're also going to have to go back to admitting that faction is what's driving government, and that different factions are contending for the attention of that government, rather than pretending that anybody can govern on behalf of all Americans, as the current phrase is. It is closer, I assume from your accent that you grew up under a parliamentary system, it is closer to a parliamentary system than to the rhetoric we currently have in the US. But given that that's the reality on the ground, it seems to me that getting to that point, doing something, for example, on change.gov, like saying, we're going to group all the drug issues here, and we're going to say we heard you, but we're not going to let you drown out the early childhood education people, or the war in Iraq people, or the prison reform people. So that each faction has some place on the stage, but you're not forcing them to take each other out in order to get the attention of the government. And when you look at things like Google Moderator and the input that Google Moderator has in the federal scene right now, it seems to me that those kinds of design principles are one of the essential things to getting to the world you imagine. Whether we can do that and how long it will take, I don't know. The U.S. is quite surprising in that issues which will seem intractable for a long time will suddenly go away in the space of a couple of years. But I certainly don't have any sense as to whether this is one of those issues now or not.
Thanks very much. And despite my accent, this wasn't a dig at the American system.
No,
in
look,
particular.
I don't even mean
think
that.
it
I was conscious while you were talking that what I was proposing sounds a lot more like a parliamentary system than like the two-party, possibly three-party system we currently have.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Hi, as another person from the same parliamentary system, my question is that of valuable things we could do with a cognitive surplus. I was wondering, how do you see social networks fitting into that hierarchy?
They don't. I think that they're more a tool. I wouldn't want to propose that Orchid, say, has one particular place there. To take just the example from here, right? Nisha Susan used a network to coordinate people to take real world action. The one thing I will say about social networks is that our bias, technologically, our bias for the last, few decades has been to lower the cost of messaging, right? And it's had all of these wonderful effects that we've seen. But that around political speech, low-cost messaging has actually become a problem, right? We now, campaigns are routinely conducted to affect the business of the U.S. Congress, which are conducted on the McDonald's business model, right? Billions and billions of emails served. And the predictive value of any one email to a representative about how their constituents feel in that district is now zero, right? You talk to people on the Hill, they don't pay any attention to that. They just read the same press releases the rest of us see and see who sent the most mail. So what started as digital activism is rapidly becoming crowdsourced PR. And that I think is one of the risks of social networks. By creating the idea that all valuable activities are low-cost activities, you see these things go by on Facebook, shout-outs for ending world hunger or whatever. And you think, there's a mismatch here between the effort being put in and the value being put out. So one of the things that was so striking to me about the Nisha Susan story, about the Mangalore story, is that she used Facebook to gather the group, but then she immediately moved to a very high-cost signal. I'm going to buy a pair of underwear, I'm going to deface it, I'm going to buy a box to put it in, and I'm going to put an address and a stamp on it. That takes a lot of effort compared to filling out your name and a zip code and pressing submit. And I'm convinced that her move to a high-cost signal is one of the things that made the government pay attention. So social networks, by providing a social graph that allows for a greatly heightened ability to find one another and to coordinate, I think need to also start producing, or activists like Susan need to add on as a layer, the ability to send high-cost signal when they're needed. Because if all we get is billions of emails served and shout-outs for ending world hunger, we actually haven't done so much to change the political culture. Anne.
Well, thanks very much, Clay, for coming today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's great to see everybody here.